Okay, so we're going to read pages 8 through 11 of George versus George. A PDF of this book is attached to this assignment, so you can go back and read it. We're going to read pages 8 through 11, and then in the next video, we're going to read pages 12 through 17. At first glance, the year was 1763, and in many ways, George Washington of America and King George III of Great Britain were very much alike. Both men had light blue eyes and reddish-brown hair. Now, there's a little bit of there's an asterisk right here. Now, that's a text feature, and that gives you, whenever you see an asterisk or a star, you can go down here at the bottom of your page, and you can find that they're trying to give you more information about this sentence. So this asterisk says, King George usually wore a white wig, which was the height of fashion in those days. George Washington sometimes powdered his hair to make it look white. So both men had light blue eyes and reddish brown hair, but George Washington wore a white wig and sometimes he powdered his hair because that was what fashion was back then. Okay, let's keep reading. Athletic and dignified in appearance, each stood well over 6 feet tall, towering above most other men during a time when the average height was 5'7". Both were honest and popular with the public. They liked simple food and much preferred plain clothes to high-fashion outfits of the period, decorated with lace, ruffles, and embroidery. King George was sometimes called Farmer George because of his long interest in agriculture. George Washington was a farmer who was the happiest when working on his land. Both were excellent horsemen and loved hunting. George Washington believed that a king should rule America. George III believed that a king should rule America. For a long time, George Washington thought so too. He even fought bravely alongside the British Army. Okay, let's go back up here, and let's look at this illustration. So right here, this is George Washington, and right here, it gives you this little guy, and he's the Indian chief, and it gives some background information about him. And it says the Indian chief, he fought along George Washington in 1755. And then here's a quote. Here's something that the Indian warrior said, the Indian chief said, Mark yon tall and daring warrior, a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire. So that's something that the Indian chief said about George Washington. And down here, this is King George, and it gives us another little person down here. This is Samuel Johnson, and he was the greatest English writer of his day. He wrote a lot of important things back then, and he says in this text bubble, of him we are much inclined to hope great things. So he's talking about King George, and he's talking about that we're expected to see great things from King George III. All right, let's go to page 11. The people of Great Britain and the people from British American colonies had a lot in common too. Most everyone on both sides of the ocean liked their good-natured young patriot king. English was their main language. After all, 60% of the colonists had British ancestors. London was everybody's capital city, and many Americans proudly thought of England as home. Great Britain had just won the 7 Years' War. Okay, we have another asterisk here, so it's going to give us more information. The part of 7 Years' War fought in North America is called the French and Indian War. So we're going to use the 7 Years' War as the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War, which involved almost every country in Europe and extended all the way to India and Australia. King George was now the ruler of the world's greatest empire. As loyal citizens of Great Britain, colonial soldiers had joined forces with soldiers from England to fight against France for control of North America. So this is what happened in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. When France gave up its territories, celebrations were held throughout England and America. Who could imagine that the fabric binding America to Great Britain was about to unravel, or that the two Georges were about to become bitter enemies? Who could guess that George III would be the last king of America and that George Washington would one day be its first president? Neither George Washington nor King George III was fully responsible for everything that happened next. Many other thinkers, soldiers, and politicians helped to shape the future. Even so, as leaders of the two sides, the two Georges were to become the strongest symbols of their countries during the next 20 years. The different ideas they stood for would soon turn the world upside down. Okay, so this illustration down here, it says rule Britannia. Britannia rule the waves. So the American colonies, they were over here. This is the American colonies, and this is the United States now. Over here is the United States. And look how happy these people are. And then all across the Atlantic Ocean is Great Britain. Okay? So this is right over here is where George Washington lived. And then over here is where King George III lived. Okay? And back before the American Revolution, these two places, the American colonies in Great Britain, they were fighting the French and Indian War. And France wanted control over the American colonies. But they fought, and then American colonies in Great Britain won, and now Great Britain was in control over the American colonies. And you can see how happy that these people are at first. You can see how happy they are, but it says in our text that who could imagine that the fabric binding America to Great Britain was about to unravel, and that the two Georges were about to become bitter enemies. So there's something that's about to happen in our book where George Washington and King George III, they turn against each other. So here's some questions that I have that I really don't understand. So we haven't found out yet why they can't get along. So we're going to figure that out later. So why couldn't King George III and George Washington get along with each other? And if the colonists and the Great Britain people from England, if they liked both of these men, why did they want to fight in war? And we see how happy they are. I notice how the people are happy on both sides. And I noticed that the American colonies in Great Britain are far apart and separated by an ocean. So this huge ocean, it separates the American colonies in Great Britain. And who do you think wins the American Revolution? Who do you think? I want you to think about it in your head.